There's been something on my mind lately which has made me rethink a lot of my own diagnoses of the problems facing the West in the modern world, and a lot of the discourse that goes on in circles that I'm both part of and the rest of society as a whole. I addressed this in a recent livestream which you might have missed because I had to private it for a few days, but you can find it on my channel now. And this is the question over ideology. How much does the ideological foundation of a society matter? What is my ideology? Well, the label I identify with the most is reactionary, and if I had to define that, I'd say it involves a belief in the positive characteristics of order and hierarchy, as opposed to the disorder brought about by libertine or egalitarian social structures. And I would say this also involves a recognition of a civilizational decay in what progressives define as progress. Now, I'm fully aware that this description is vague. What policies does it suggest? Does it mean I support a free market economy or a welfare state? Do I support more government power or less? Now, I certainly have opinions on these matters. I'm generally in favor of the free market, but I have plenty of criticisms of the modern capitalist system. I don't necessarily want the government running people's lives, but I do think the use of power to defend against subversion is legitimate. And I'll take a position on each issue as I see fit, but what underlies my position on almost every issue is the vision I have for a more conservative society. One where there is purpose, culture, order, belonging, and the ability to reach self-actualization. This really is what my fight is for. I'd say this is the unifying factor that underlies the right, the vision of the world that those on the right seem to be striving for. But there is many different labels and ideologies that people with this vision subscribe to. The most descriptive label I would subscribe to myself is nationalist, which prescribes several policies when it comes to things like citizenship, immigration, sovereignty of a populace, and so on. But the reason I've adopted this position is because I tend to think it'll work towards the vision of a more conservative society. I'd say those on the left have a vision of a more egalitarian world, where they can do away with the perceived injustices of society and people can live in harmony with a sense of liberation and equality. And the policies that those on the left support seem to push society in that direction. I'd say this is the fundamental divide between left and right. Now, I want to make it clear that ideology does matter when it comes to achieving these goals. Absolute monarchy would obviously push society in a rightward direction, while anarcho-communism would push it in a leftward one. That goes without saying. But I think there's a problem in seeing ideology as the sole driving force behind this phenomenon. For the purposes of those on the dissident right who see something deeply wrong with the West as it exists today and the direction it's headed in, we often try to pinpoint what exactly is the cause for the decline. This is a question that's been on my mind for several years now, and it's something I still haven't fully been able to understand. In reactionary circles, people often identify the French Revolution as the starting point of the West's descent to where it is today. And for a while, I subscribed to this belief, that the ideas of the Enlightenment are behind the decline. That liberalization has been justified by the assumptions about the world the Enlightenment has given the West, setting in motion the Whig progress of history, which I, as a reactionary, consider to be civilizational decay. Now, I have not made a 180 on this by any means. In fact, I was actually going to follow up my video on Frankenstein with the first of several videos critiquing the Enlightenment. Those will still be made, but it might be best that I made this video first. I think the mistake I made was that I assigned too much blame to the ideology of liberalism for the decline of the West. Now, to be clear, I still consider classical liberalism to be an outdated system designed for a different era and to be based on falsehoods about humanity. I'm confident that liberalism cannot lead the West forward. While I stand by my criticisms of liberalism, I previously thought it was a particularly bad ideology which was the driving force behind the West's decline, but I don't think that that's really the case. Because while the ideological underpinnings of a society have an effect on the direction the society goes, any ideology, no matter what the creators originally prescribed, can be corrupted, decay, and become destructive. Because man is an imperfect creature and there is no ideology that can save him from himself. And I think that the crisis that the West is facing today is, at its root, a spiritual one. That Western man has become weak, that he's lost the drive that made him what he once was. And I think this might have less to do with the political structures of the West today than I originally thought, and more to do with modernity. I'd say that when people become too accustomed to wealth and comfort, they become weak. They lose the fortitude that got them to where they are, and the moral fabric of society begins to fall apart from there. And I believe that this can happen under any ideology, any political structure, or any religion. The mistake I made was I focused too much on the historical period in the West from the French Revolution to the modern day. From there I drew a line and said, this is our civilizational decay. I failed to realize that this phenomenon has occurred in other civilizations, ones that had very different ideological foundations to the post-Enlightenment West. I discussed this in the live stream I had with On the Offensive on the essay Fate of Empires. Civilizational decline has taken place on many occasions historically. The most obvious example being the Roman Empire, where the various social structures of a once great empire fell apart over time, much like what's happening to the West today. Empires begin to decline when the people become weak, and I tend to think the ideology to justify the decline comes after. A contradiction I found in my own worldview is that while I'm a major critic of liberalism, democracy, and the Enlightenment, I have a deep admiration for the Victorian era, in particular Canada in the late 19th century under the reign of Queen Victoria. While my fascination is with the rich culture, their achievements, and their overall civilizational confidence, it is true that Victorian Britain, and the British Empire as an extension, was a politically liberal society for its time. It was a democracy, albeit a limited one. It had a liberal constitution, and it was a society that had implemented the Enlightenment values that I'm so critical of. Yet they created the greatest empire in history. Now, even though Victorian Britain, and as an extension Canada, was politically liberal, socially it was a very conservative society. There was a strict hierarchical social order, and this is what created the culture that I find so fascinating. The same could be said about the United States in the 19th century. It was a politically liberal nation for its time. While not being quite as hierarchical as Britain, it had a strong, healthy social order. American men of the 19th century are some of the greatest the West has ever seen, yet today, under the exact same constitution, they've become weak. And though I do recognize the symptoms of the decline existed, I'd argue that nations like Canada, America, Britain remained healthy, stable, and confident societies well into the 20th century. Though I have many problems with the foundational beliefs of liberalism, it wasn't until the latter half of the 20th century, after the West had undergone the trauma of 2 world wars, and had become so accustomed to material decadence that liberalism truly became the destructive force that it is today. And I feel that's because it's a system that, while flawed, was designed to function in a moral society. Once the West's morality, fortitude, and civilizational confidence evaporated, the liberal system became the means through which the West deconstructed itself. And I believe that rather than the ideology being the driving force behind the decay is the driving force behind the ideology. Once the West became spiritually weak, it began to justify its decline through what liberalism has become today, progressivism. A concept in neo-reaction is the constant societal drift to the left. That over the course of time, the West has become more left-wing, the Whig progress of history. For an explanation on this phenomenon, I'll link to you a video by the Distributist explaining it. This is what progressives consider progress and what reactionaries consider destruction. But I do not believe that the French Revolution was the force that set this drift to the left in motion. Rather, I believe that if the right represents order, then the drift to the left is that social order falling apart. And the driving force behind that is man becoming weaker, be it through spiritual demoralization or through material decadence. And while I certainly believe that some ideologies are better than others, there's no ideology that is not vulnerable to degradation and subversion. That's because humans are responsible for implementing political systems, but since they're imperfect beings, they're subject to corruption. And I think that people on the dissident right need to keep this in mind. This is one of my major problems with propertarianism and Kurt Doolittle. They market their ideology as a parasitism-proof system. That you just need to make a few changes to constitutionalism and it will forever eliminate leftist parasitism. The problem is that people have to implement this system, and they can be corrupted. The United States didn't have the problems with progressivism that it does today when it was a spiritually stronger society. Yet in the 21st century, laws written in the 18th century are being used to justify things their writers never intended. It's because those who are responsible for interpreting those laws have become corrupted by decay and subversion. And that's mainly due to the human factor. Another talking point I sometimes come across is the argument that Christianity is behind the decline of the West. That the core principles found in the New Testaments are what justified the road to progressivism today. This is an even more flawed argument though, because Christianity was the basis of the West morality for 1500 years. If it only became destructive within the last 50 years when it became less influential, then clearly it's not the root of the decline. While I admit that the institution of the church today is corrupt, much like liberalism, the corruption followed the decay. It did not precede it. It was only until after Christian morality fell apart in the West that the church gave in to progressivism. Much like the Constitution of the United States, Christian scripture was post hoc reinterpreted to suit the degenerate state the West fell into. It never prescribed it, it was just used to justify something it was never intended to. On my point that this can happen to any ideology, today we think of Islam as an ultra-conservative and aggressive religion. But as I discussed in my stream with On the Offensive, when the Arab Empire of Baghdad became decadent, an Islamic society became progressive just like the Christian West has today. They saw things like the loss of morality, the feminization of men, the influx of foreigners, materialism, and their empire eventually fell apart. And Islam couldn't prevent that, because regardless of what its scripture said, their people became weak, and the ideology followed after. One final example of this mistake of assigning all the blame to ideology is the belief that the decline of the West could have been avoided if the Axis had won the Second World War. That fascism is a system that could have prevented the problems we face today. I don't identify as a fascist, but I can put aside the demonic connotations that the contemporary West places upon the ideology, and say that the view that our problems could have been avoided by fascism is very flawed. I'll link you to an interesting video where Millennial Woes discusses this. There's no guarantee that a post-war Europe under fascist rule wouldn't become materially decadent and spiritually weak, as has happened to Europe today. Because as we've seen, any ideology can be subverted and turned into something destructive. If the people that interpret it are weak, it'll fall apart. People often point out, quite correctly, that if the Allies could have seen the world of child drag queens, critical race theory, and mass migration today, they wouldn't have gone off to fight in the war. It wouldn't have been worth it. We actually have testimonies from veterans to confirm this. But it would be a mistake to assume that had the other side won, they couldn't possibly have suffered the same fate of not getting what they thought they were fighting for. I mean, for example, Eastern Europe fell to communism after the war, a far-left ideology, yet today, Eastern Europe is more right-wing than Western Europe. The thing is, you don't know how these things are going to play out. The point is, there is no right-wing ideology that's completely immune to the corruption of leftism. Because the civilizational decline represented by the drift to the left, masked only by technological advancement, is not the result of a failure of ideology, but a failure of human fortitude. First, civilizations become spiritually and physically weak. Then the changes in ideology come after to justify that. For example, in the Roman Empire, citizenship was once only held by a select group of people from the Italian peninsula. Later in the empire, after it reached its height, it was expanded to all subjects. And while this might seem like a progressive measure to a liberal mind, it proved destructive, because it gave the power of citizenship to those who were less loyal to Rome. There's even plenty of stories in the Bible where the people of Israel lose faith in God and begin to worship idols. They're always struck with disaster shortly after. Jeremiah describes the degenerate state Israel and its ruling elites were in just before it was sacked by Nebuchadnezzar, resulting in the Babylonian exile. As civilizations are in decline, they become politically progressive. Their healthy social order falls apart in the name of a misguided sense of progress. And I'd say that cultural Marxism and intersectionality today are just the modern manifestation of this. They're the result of a materially wealthy yet spiritually dead West, which has lost the civilizational strength that made it what it was. Now, I am of the opinion that the institutions of the West were subverted over the past several decades, and that a lot of people that push social justice are bad actors who just use progressive politics as the justification for globalism. But I think it's a mistake to attribute all of the West's decline to the Marxist infiltration of our institutions. Because the sad reality is that we allowed it to happen. There's always been enemies of the West, but in modernity, despite all the wealth and technology imaginable, we lack the strength to stop them. And there is no political system that can save us from ourselves, be it constitutionalism, proprietarianism, fascism, or absolutism. There is no ideology that can replace human fortitude. That comes first. A healthy societal consensus for civilization comes next. You know, I often think of myself and ask, do I embody the resolve of my ancestors? The Europeans who settled Canada? And I must admit, the answer is no. It's not for a lack of trying, but I am a product of modernity, just like everyone else. And even if the dissident right won tomorrow and we could implement our political system, I know I'd still have a long way to go before I could overcome modernity and embody the strength of those that came before me. And I think that first and foremost, that should be our goal. Because the state of the West today is the result of a spiritual sickness, and our political system is just a manifestation of such. And I fear that no change will come until we can fix ourselves first. It starts with rejecting materialism, demoralization, and nihilism, and replacing them with morality, confidence, and purpose, overcoming the weakness that has allowed us to fall to where we are today. First, we must become strong, and societal change will follow after. If you enjoyed this video, please like, share, or subscribe, and follow me on Twitter. And if you'd like to support the channel, you can now do so. Links are down below. Now, I was planning on creating my own Discord server, but I was banned from Discord. I lost my account and all my contacts. So if you were friends with me on Discord or you would like to add me, here's my new account. I'll be trying to recreate my network before I set up my own server. You can find me here. Thank you for listening. Till next time, endeavor.